Welcome, everyone, to Stat's virtual event, a look ahead at biotech in 2021, sponsored by Brunswick. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matt Herper, Senior Writer for Medicine here at Stat, and in just a few minutes, I'll be welcoming my colleagues to discuss what we can expect to see from the biotech industry in the year ahead. But first, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. There's a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Use the chat feature to talk to each other or to send messages directly to the Stat team, which is using the handle Stat Events. But do not put your questions for us in the chat. Instead, if you do have questions for us, and I really hope you do, that's what's going to make this fun, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Again, the Q&A icon, not the chat icon. Use the Q&A feature to type your question, and we will try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you would most like to see answered. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. This is part of what makes these events special. Thanks again to all of you for being here. And before we get started, I'd like to welcome Raul Damas, partner and head of U.S. healthcare practice at Brunswick, for a brief introduction to today's event. Take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you before our program begins. This is Brunswick's third year sponsoring this event, so I want to thank the team at Stat for their continued partnership. And thanks to all of you for participating. I hope we get to meet in person again next year. At Brunswick, we help companies and their leaders tell complex stories during challenging situations. So 2020 has demanded a lot from us, as it has from everyone. We work across industries, but within the span of a few weeks last March, it seemed that every one of our clients had transformed into a healthcare company. That's because every leader was consumed with protecting the health and safety of their workforce, while also navigating and operating an environment dominated by health concerns. We've learned a great deal since then, and I'd like to briefly share 3 observations and their implications for the healthcare sector. I'll begin with how we're consuming information in the COVID era. Much has been said about the prevalence of poor quality information and misinformation about COVID, but not enough has been said about the increased availability of high quality health information and the public's seemingly inexhaustible appetite for it. Mainstream media is devoting unprecedented resources toward explaining complex topics like epidemiology, vaccine development, and life science supply chains. At the same time, the pandemic has pushed healthcare publications like Stat News further into the mainstream. The result is that COVID has significantly increased the public's interest in and aptitude for health and science information. And we believe this trend will persist. This has significant implications for how healthcare companies communicate. While there are more people interested in the sector's work, they're also more demanding in terms of the timeliness, quality, and clarity of the information they consume. Another thing we've learned is how complicated the public's relationship to its own health information can be. We entered 2020 expecting increased debate and controversy around the topic of healthcare data privacy. At the same time, it was unclear how pressing a concern it actually was for the average person. So one thing we watched closely was how people responded to the many ways our pandemic response relied on the availability and use of personal health information. Prime example is our nation's contact tracing efforts, which have unfortunately failed to reach the participation levels necessary to identify the path of the virus and better contain it. What COVID revealed is that individuals, when provided a choice, are quite reluctant to share personal information, even when its use is tied to the public good. So what does this mean for companies that employ patient-level data? They need to continue explaining what data they have, how it's used, and how they protect it. Most important, they have to better explain how individuals' data translates into better health for them and their loved ones. The key is using increased transparency and clarity to build trust, something that's critical to the final topic, our nation's vaccination effort. The pandemic has complicated our understanding of Americans' views on vaccines. Historically, the common understanding was that we had so-called anti-vaxxers on one side and everyone else on the other. We've since realized that the public's views on vaccines run along a spectrum. Surveys suggest about 40% of Americans would be unlikely or definitely unwilling to take a COVID vaccine. That's far greater than the small percentage of people we'd assumed were fundamentally opposed to vaccination. Worse, the most at-risk populations say they're least likely to take the vaccine. So our national conversation about vaccines needs to be calibrated to the range of people's views. Companies discussing vaccines with their employees should consider employing the approach they use with voting, which is underscoring the importance of this act to the health of our nation, providing resources and information, and then encouraging employees to participate in the process. This won't work for everyone, but it's preferable to overly aggressive messages or finger wagging, which have proven counterproductive during a pandemic. In summary, the past year has demonstrated that effective communications can be an important public health tool. Now, with the public increasingly seeking clear, timely, and high-quality information about COVID-19 and our pandemic response, business leaders, particularly in the healthcare sector, can and must play a leadership role in providing that information. They have the tools to do so. So thank you again for joining today's event, and I'll now hand it back over to Matt Herper.
All right, thank you, Roel. That was great. I'm now going to introduce our amazing panel. Adam Feuerstein, Senior Writer for Biotech at STAT, Damien Garde, National Biotech Reporter at STAT, and Kate Sheridan, the General Assignment Reporter here at STAT. Thanks to all of you for joining me today. Quick reminder, fill up that Q&A tab. There are already 17 questions there. We'd love more. So we're going to get started here. And so
happy holidays, everyone. Sorry,
happy
Matt.
holidays to you, Adam. I think, hopefully there will be some discussion and dissent here, but I think we can all agree on something, which is that 2020 was a terrible year. So I think we'll start off by moving directly to 2021 without any recap. And I just want to ask each of you, what's the biggest trend or idea that you think people should be thinking about that maybe they're not? Adam, why don't you go first?
The biggest trend that people are not thinking about?
Sure. Just pick something.
Well, I mean, if we stick to COVID stuff, I mean, maybe, the possibility that other vaccines and therapeutics don't work. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people are thinking about that, but that could be a potential problem. And then non-COVID, maybe, I think one thing that has become very clear this year is that, biotech healthcare are not only defensive in a sort of global pandemic world, but has also kind of changed the world. I mean, it's not, biotech has been responsible for all these things that are kind of getting us out of it. And as we sort of move forward into 2021, if we think about kind of getting into sort of a post-COVID world, from a stock perspective, I think you can see maybe investors kind of shifting their focus away from biotech into other, the areas where they didn't want to invest in 2020, they might want to invest in 2021, that are maybe less defensive. So this sort of incredible stock performance that we've seen in biotech in 2020 may not be sustainable through sort of the end of next year.
So because biotech was the thing that was working, it was the thing to buy this year.
Biotech was working, it was defensive, and plus obviously grabbing an incredible amount of attention because of all the vaccines and drugs that were being developed for COVID.
But a vaccine works and maybe you can invest in hotels again, or maybe something sexier than that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Kate? What should people be paying attention to next year?
Well, I think people are already paying attention to this that I'm going to suggest, to be honest, but I do want to underscore it anyway. I think the Zoomification of everything is going to be really important in 2021. I realize we're kind of here to bury the year that was in all of its horrors, but it's still going to be very similar, I think, in the early part of 2021 to what we've already experienced. And I'll be really interested to see kind of like what parts of pandemic life persist into the post-vaccine world. I think there's a lot of opportunity with Zoom and with adding it into our I guess, normal repertoire. But I'll be curious to see what people actually decide to take up. I'm happy to get into like more of what the effects of more Zoom could be, but maybe that's something for later.
Mm-hmm. Damien?
I mean, this might be a little bit galaxy brain, but after the Alexion buyout, it occurred to me that, well, one, there was a time in which biotech was considered, or sort of the barometer of big biotech were like the four horsemen, however one might define them, but they generally included Celgene, Gilead, and Biogen. And then I think the fourth maybe would be Influx. And I think, the buyout of Celgene, which is now years in the past, was a function of Celgene kind of sputtering on finding a next phase on how to grow. And the Alexion story, I think, is a little bit different, but in that there was an incredible recovery there. But I do think that taking that deal, however smart it might seem from AstraZeneca's perspective, is putting a cap on what Alexion could do as an independent company. And so that has me turning to the other horse people, like Biogen and Vertex are the ones that come to mind immediately, who are not in dire straits by any means. But I think that those deals are a reminder that there isn't that much of a safety net for these companies, even though they're very large and storied and have made all these wonderful drugs. So for Biogen, which has a very, very important first and second quarter of next year, and then maybe to a lesser extent for Vertex, which is a very healthy business, but has to kind of develop its pipeline in a way that people find impressive and trustworthy. One thing I'll be looking out for next year is Gilead maybe had kind of a, not stay of execution, but I think remdesivir has really helped them forestall some of the questions that they're kind of yet to answer with respect to their future. And so coming next year, I'll be watching the like big biotech companies of yore to see if they really can survive for years to come, because on the other end of that are big pharma companies that also struggle to grow. And so you can see kind of marriages of convenience cropping up next year, depending on how things go.
So Adam, we've written a lot about Gilead and its non-COVID efforts, as well as doing a bunch of stories on remdesivir. And they did make a big buy of Immunomedics. How close do you think, with Damien mentioned this, that Gilead is to kind of getting the naysayers to maybe back off a bit at least?
Well, the Galapagos thing that just happened, filgotinib not filing an RA, and that was, if we think back to a year ago, we were talking about Gilead and this gigantic deal that they did, kind of partnership with Galapagos as kind of a big pipeline filler, and now I think there's a lot of questions about that. So, and whether that, the money they spent there, I forget how many billions of dollars were invested there, but whether that's really going to pay off. So I think that maybe people are, okay with Immunomedics for now, but now are questioning the Galapagos deal. So I think that they're going to be, that's something that's going to weigh on them now. So I think that people are not ready to kind of just say, hey, yeah, Gilead is is moving forward in a positive direction. I think, this thing that happened this week was, or I guess it was yesterday, was a setback.
So we had some stuff planned, but the audience is being amazing and participating, and we've already got a sea of hands. And
there are a lot of questions.
So many, and give us more. But there's one I really like here from Dan Aramian, which is there was some thinking that when a vaccine was developed, this would provide some goodwill toward the biopharma industry. Do you believe this has happened? This has been one of the big, I feel like this has been one of the big questions of my whole career, of why do people hate drug companies, right? And there is this big hope that the triumph of these vaccines would change this. And I think there has been some, it's probably the nicest the media has been to a Pfizer CEO maybe ever, in terms of what Albert Bourla has been able to accomplish there with this vaccine. But do we think that that's affecting the whole industry, and how long will the halo last?
I don't know if it's affecting the whole industry. I mean, it has been surreal to see Pfizer, a word synonymous with big pharma, a phrase synonymous with like corporate bad deeds in the minds of many people, become instead this thing that people long for in an almost like religious sense, because they have develop this vaccine that a lot of people perceive probably accurately as the means to return to normalcy. But as to whether it trickles down, or whatever the right verb is, to other drug companies, I don't know. I haven't seen that to the extent that I'm like plugged into the discourse, which is maybe debatable. Like, if you feel positively toward Pfizer, you receive this vaccine, et cetera, does that halo extend to Merck if they don't end up developing a vaccine? Does it extend to Gilead, or to, manufacturer X of whatever medicine someone was already upset about the price of? Like, a lot of the touch points that have made pharma so unpopular in recent years have to do with things like insulin and cancer, which are completely separate from vaccines or from COVID-19. So I'm a little skeptical that there will be, one, a halo effect that extends to companies outside this world, and two, a longevity of the goodwill, because you're always kind of one scandal away from reminding people of their deep-seated and long-held mistrust, frankly, of the drug industry.
I actually want to mention something that Damien just brought up as well. Like, I think a lot of the halo, and I'm not an expert on this, and in fact, Matt, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this as well. I'd be interested to know how much of this halo effect, if it exists, is linked to the fact that right now people aren't aware of the price of a COVID vaccine or the price of a COVID treatment. There's been a lot of work to give these treatments to people and these vaccines to people at a reasonable or a no cost basis, right? Like, if people were paying out of pocket for these things, would they actually be more inclined to distrust pharma, or would they be less inclined to give them this halo? I don't know. If you're in a global pandemic and someone is charging you money, even if it is just cost, what does that do? So
companies are the way the EUA's law is built, all this stuff is being bought by the government right now.
Right.
So we're not feeling that cost tension, which is one of the big things that gets companies. I think if there is a benefit to the industry, it's not so much the goodwill, but that this got across that the developing medicines is a hard thing to do, but that's going to be a double-edged sword because it happens so fast. So now you're also going to have people wondering, well, why can't my cancer drug be developed that fast? And the reality is that, well, first, the pandemic was a special situation, but also it was a situation where it was relatively expensive, but easy to run these giant trials, which got us these answers very quickly. And
Matt, don't you think it's an interesting dichotomy in some way, in that you have investors who are bidding up the value of vaccine companies because they believe that there's sort of this long tail. There's a business in vaccines beyond EUAs that will generate billions of dollars in sales. But in order to do that, they're going to have to charge premium prices at some point, and that could antagonize people, like Kate said,
right,
who all of a sudden will have to start paying, for these things. So, something is going to have to give there.
And I think especially because people haven't been paying for it right now, I think it's going to make that question and that tension even more serious, even more severe whenever it does happen, right?
Well,
why could they give it away for free then, but not now?
The reason that Pfizer is in vaccines is because they were able to get premium pricing for the new versions of Prevnar, which is their pneumococcal vaccine. That was Katherine Janssen's job, the woman who runs vaccines. They're an amazing scientist. That's what she came there to build. And one question investors haven't really been grappling with is, if these vaccines are so effective at generating antibody response, are we really going to need boosters? Which originally the bull case on these was that people would not only be getting COVID vaccines now, but that everybody was going to need boosters, and that would become a recurring market. I think there's some question on that right now. So let's take another question that's sort of related to this and is also the most upvoted question in the chat, which is from Diane Bryson. COVID has awakened the industry to two things, probably more than that, Diane. But biotech companies are not as engaged with patients as they thought, and clinical trials have got to become more diverse to ensure that drugs are tested in the demographic in which the medicine will be used. What's going to be the result of those realizations? I think the big question here is that diversity question. it really was a huge push with the COVID trials, and it's been something we've been hearing about in trials, for a while, but it really became so imperative here. But also, I guess the COVID trials also did remind one that when we got these first COVID trials, the phase 1 trials were all white men, that those were the easiest volunteers to get. And it was a struggle to get the diversity numbers up. We've written a lot about having to outreach to communities. Are clinical trials going to finally get more diverse? I mean, does anyone have any thoughts?
I think people, maybe regular readers of Stat, know that, we have now kind of tried to, when we write about clinical trials and studies, we try to include the racial demographic information in there. And oftentimes you have to ask, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm curious, like Kate and Damien, and Matt, even your experience, you get you see a study and, it's published somewhere or it's a press release and like, there's not any demographic information. There's no breakdown. And you have to go and say, by the way, give me that information. And there's always this sort of, my experience is there's like this, a little bit of an uncomfortable silence, and then they tell you if they have it. And then there's always sort of this defensive kind of, we're trying harder. So I think to answer the question, I think companies are aware of it. And I do think that there are some efforts underway and that are, kind of part of the sort of George Floyd stuff that happened this year and other things that the companies are aware that they need to do a better job of having clinical trials reflect the diversity of this country and the diversity of the people who ultimately will want to or need to take these medicines. And that's an important thing. And so we'll just have to see, I think. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
I'm both optimistic and pessimistic. So, Matt, to your point, you mentioned the difficulty of recruiting patients who weren't white men is something that we kind of saw play out for some of these vaccine trials. And so the optimistic side is I would hope that the experience of this unprecedented nationwide event of recruiting these trials would create kind of a virtuous cycle, that these companies and these doctors did their jobs well. And so thus, the members of these communities who've been underrepresented in clinical trials will see the data, see it presented, et cetera, and it'll engender a little bit more of a willingness, to the extent that the problem is an unwillingness, which I think is, could be debated, but will engender more willingness to join clinical trials among communities who have been pretty reasonably skeptical in the past. Where I'm pessimistic is that I just don't see a carrot or stick for the industry to keep this going. I'm not suggesting they're being disingenuous when they say it's important, but it's a conversation we've had for a long time. There was a really good ProPublica story maybe 2 or 3 years ago about the sort of unbearable whiteness of oncology trials. And everyone, it was Caroline Chen, sorry, Caroline, if you're listening, Caroline Chen who wrote that, and everyone involved said the right things about how important it was. There's certain cancers that disproportionately affect Black people, and yet the data that was used to get FDA approval for them did not reflect whatsoever that population. And in that trial, or in that story, a lot of people said, well, maybe the FDA should require it, or maybe the industry should band together to whatever. And these were all interesting ideas, but none of them have been implemented. So, the stick in COVID-19 was companies realizing that if they want people to take this vaccine, they need to enroll populations that reflect America. I'm not sure where the stick is once we're out of the pandemic. If the FDA will still approve your drug, no matter, the demographics of who it's studied in, if people will still reimburse for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what's going to make the people with power do the right thing?
It really felt like the NIH was playing a key role there too, that they were there saying, I don't care, Moderna, your trial has to slow down. And that Pfizer knew they were competing against that, right? So you had all these pressures that we don't normally have. My one optimism would be, we have seen, for instance, Bristol Myers just announced a major initiative and put some money behind it. You still wonder whether it's enough, right? Another question that's coming up a lot that I want to start with you, Kate, with, I've seen this twice in the chat. I'm going to ask it from Eric Gordon, who's someone we quote fairly often. Do you think we could face another funding winter for biotech and startup pharma if the run-up in valuations of public and private companies turns into a crash for most of them? In other words, I think on our prep call, we all wondered at the fact that the biotech fundraising has continued apace this entire year, and it's actually been a great year to raise money. But is winter coming?
I'm going to
one-
answer this.
Adam.
I'm going to answer this question from the private company's perspective, because that's kind of where I feel most comfortable speaking from. And then Damien and Adam, if there's something you want to add from the more public markets perspective, please do. But for me, I don't think it's slowing down next year. I mean, it might slow down a little bit just because I think there was a lot of excitement and a lot of urgency felt among biotech to like just get out there and do something, like shore up your companies, make sure they have what they need to weather whatever's coming next. So maybe there will be a little bit of a slowdown, but I really don't think that it's going to crash. The point about valuations is a really interesting one, though, I think, because it is getting pretty expensive to invest in American biotech. However, going back to what I said in the beginning, I think one thing that I'm going to watch for a little bit next year is to see whether or not more investors cross the Atlantic and go look at European biotech. You know, we had a conversation earlier this week where, you know, I mentioned the fact that I don't even think we covered the BioNTech IPO. A lot of people did, but it was a relatively it wasn't exactly the first thing on our radar, basically. And obviously now it is. And I think it was flying a little bit under our radars, at least, partially because it was very similar to things we already were interested in. So we it wasn't the first, it wasn't new, it wasn't flashy, but also it was in Europe. And I think the one thing that I've heard over and over again from investors that do go out to Europe is they're cheaper than American biotechs. They don't need quite as much money to get going. And the science is still great. There are wonderful scientists working in Europe. Obviously, there are wonderful institutions turning out interesting IP in Europe, but it's never really attracted as much attention as it has the Boston biotech companies, the SF biotech companies, that kind of thing. So now that Zoom is a part of our lives, now that it is much easier to go to Europe to look at a company or to talk to their management team, I'll be interested to see whether more money flows into Europe, possibly because of the valuation issue, but also just because there's a lot of money still left to be invested. Biotech VCs alone raised a lot of money just before the pandemic. All that has to go somewhere. So I'm sure it will. Just where, I think, is the open question. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a wonderful time to be a private company. I mean, Kate, to your point, how much money there is that has to be invested on the VC part, but also I feel like the short-term effect of like the SPAC explosion, the special purpose acquisition company, these blank check companies, for the most part, have to find a merger target within 2 years or they have to give the money back. So of the, I lost count how many biotech or healthcare focused SPACs went public in 2020. For the ones that haven't yet merged, 2021 is actually like kind of important for them. And so if you're an investor in the SPACs, it might become kind of a market for lemons if things play out a certain way. But if you're a private biotech company, it's like musical chairs. Like they don't want to give the money back, I'm assuming, because they take a nice haircut off of whatever they end up doing. So that should probably keep, one would assume from the VC side, that should keep it looking good to invest in biotech, because there are now so many ways to get the exit between IPO and buyout, and now so many SPACs. On the public investor side, I don't know. I mean, Adam, does for the generalists?
Well, I guess the question is,
yeah, go ahead.
You guys know that, like, you know, when you make these investments, and I think Eric in the Q&A, I think he followed up on it. And the problem is that if you invest early at such a high valuation, then you have to, you know, there's always a need for more money down the road. Particularly some of these, like, you know, whether it's a private biotech or a public, like a lot of these, Damien, as you know, like a lot of these IPOs, right? They're like preclinical companies that are coming out in incredibly high valuations. I mean, you know, you're eventually going to have to refinance and raise more money. And how do you keep raising money can you raise money at higher and higher valuations? Or do you, when you ultimately have to step back and the valuations fall, like what happens at that point? Is that kind of when people start getting angry, you know, inevitably that may happen, right? I mean,
yeah,
well,
arguably the leading indicator in 2021 would be follow-on offerings, less so than IPOs, because then you kind of get the idea of just how much appetite is there for something that isn't the hot new thing, but that an idea people used to like, and now it needs another X $100 million to prosecute it. And do people still want to pay for that?
Exactly. I agree, because I think at a certain point, like VCs have raised so much money that there's almost this momentum where they can't necessarily just stop investing and stop pushing these companies further and further down the course, down the course towards becoming a public company, they just can't do that. Like that's not going to work. So I think that's actually a really interesting point, that maybe that's the indicator to watch, not necessarily VC financings themselves or IPOs themselves.
Moderna is really probably one of the great unicorn success stories ever now, right? Like this was a company that a lot of people were very, very skeptical of, not without some reason. But boy, aren't we all glad they raised all that money. And whether we could probably spend this whole call discussing their valuation and whether or not this is all going to pay off. But I think we're all really glad that they persevered and had that money right now. But we've also seen from kind of that same era of unicorn funding, I think Intarsia just finished its story. I mean, that was going to be a great big deal. They had amazing amounts of funding and it didn't work out. So I do think that we are going to see, it's always the mix of believing the hope and fearing the hype, right? Should we take another question? So our most upvoted question in the Q&A is short and tough. And just one of those brilliant simple questions that we all should be asking ourselves as reporters. From Carling Leung, I'm probably butchering your name, Carling. What do you expect the biggest impact the Biden administration will have in its first year on biotech and healthcare? What will they actually get done?
I don't know if we can answer this until January, to be honest, right? Like, there's a lot that could be done, I suppose, by executive order, but there's an awful lot that probably ought to be done through a legislature. Someone else step in and give a better answer, because that one's kind of a cop-out.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're right about a policy standpoint, Kate. I would just say maybe just the reintroduction of science into American life, and there's something that we've talked about a lot this year, and how science has become basically attacked and played out that way, and doubted and politicized. Maybe, hopefully, we have an administration, and it seems like that, looking at kind of the people that he's putting into key roles, that science, becomes a trustworthy thing again, and then that and from that many positive things can flow, hopefully.
I think probably nothing of real substance, but I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing from a drug industry standpoint. Like Adam, to your point, Trump's approach to science, I know, has been irksome, to say the least, among science people, but I'm not sure it's really been deleterious to the drug industry. Like having the president say, have you considered bleach? I mean, it's, whatever, right? But I don't know if that means people aren't filling their prescriptions or anything that actually affects the P&L of pharma. And then the risk of Donald Trump, who was relatively unpredictable, of things like an executive order for a most favored nations clause, or any of the things that were really lasered in on bringing down the cost of medicine at the expense of the drug industry. I don't know what's in Joe Biden's mind or heart or soul, but I don't think we've gotten any indication that he is considering swashbuckling attempts to take on pharma. And to the extent that they've talked a lot about healthcare, it's about various means that they perceive would strengthen the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act was great for pharma for the most part. So if his broad goals are getting more people insured at whatever cost, that just expands the customer pool for the drug industry. And then as to, what could be bad on the financial regulation side, I don't think Joe Biden, senator from Delaware, has really made his name on cracking down on the financial sector. So it could just be a period of relatively banal tranquility, which I guess from the eyes of pharma would be a positive. I mean, I think they probably see that they can get a little bit more purchase in a Biden administration through the old-fashioned forms of lobbying, because he's appointing names they recognize, versus in the early days of the Trump transition, we were all frantically Googling seasteading to figure out how the FDA might work. And so this is sort of a return to just bland American executive.
Well, and part of the reason as well that I said I'm not sure we can say with any certainty what will happen is until January is not because I want to wait to see what he does. It's because I want to wait to see who he's working with, right? Like either we're going to have a bland administration that doesn't necessarily go after drug pricing, doesn't necessarily go after these kind of like big, flashy pharma related targets. It could also be they just can't, right? Like I think we've all kind of learned over the last, let's say 2-3 weeks, that if the legislature doesn't want to do something, it's not going to, and there's nothing a president can really do about that if it needs to go through a Senate or if it needs to go through the House. Like that's kind of what I mean at a certain point when I say we don't know until January. We don't know what.
You know what's really going to matter, Kate?
Yeah.
Georgia.
Yeah, I was going to say
this is
Georgia.
what I'm saying. Exactly. That's what I meant by January is like we don't know until Georgia decides whether or not the Senate's going to be under Republican control or Democratic control. That I think is a really, I don't know how much of a difference it will make, but I think it could make a fairly substantial difference. So
the COVID response could change in some really palpable ways. There have been, the Rockefeller Foundation has a new report out today about how to implement testing in schools and get all kids in school up through high school, back to school even before the effects of a vaccine kick in. There have been a lot of antigen tests bought by the government. I'm not sure where they are. It's possible that we could see a lot of movement on that end. There are certainly a lot of ideas about how we could be responding better in a way that would better control the pandemic as it rages on. The problem obviously is January 20th, it's going to be a very long month until then, and how many of those things can happen immediately. Another really smart thing, which came in a question from Akua Robertson, but which is something that will give Biden some real leverage on drug pricing, is the most favored nations executive order. To the extent that Biden, even if he's going to repeal it, if he leaves it around for a while, that is a powerful negotiating stick with the industry. And if Biden does want to get something done on drug prices, which he probably does, there are all sorts of, the Trump administration really seemed at different moments like they were going to try every approach that you could take in drug pricing. So there have been a lot of experiments, and if he's more measured, a new president could try one and see if it works. That probably won't have immediate short-term effects, but could have some real long-term effects on the industry.
Can I ask a question that comes up? Let's
Sure.
do the JPM question. So what's the one thing that you will all miss most about not doing JPM in person? Matt?
I like seeing people in San Francisco. I have friends there, and I like seeing all the people who come to San Francisco. The social part of JPM is, I think, what one misses. I will say that of the meetings I am missing, I think I miss JPM least. I miss going into New York for investor meetings that are only a day. I miss medical meetings. I really thought ASH was a lot less fun doing it virtually. The same thing with the cardiology meetings, that feeling you get when you're at a meeting and so many of the people you want to talk to are there and you've all kind of dedicated time and are in the same place is hard to replicate. JP Morgan's always kind of tough and was always on my list of maybe I can get out of this one, although I usually enjoy it, particularly because San Francisco is a great place to stay. What about you, Adam?
Well, I think I'll miss making coffee for Damien at 4:00 in the morning. And that's the inside joke. We all share a house at Stat House that we rent. And yeah, it was really fun getting up at 3:30, 4:00 in the morning and starting to work right away, right? Damien, that was always fun.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo, to an extent, yeah, I would, because I mean, it's been an annual tradition is a strong term, but it's been an annual obligation of mine for many years now. And I would echo what Matt said. There are people I really only see, people I like, who I only see once a year because of JP Morgan. And so obviously that'll lapse this year. But then even to the stat thing, by virtue of sharing a house, we, at least the past few years, have like all gotten together at the end of it and just sat around in a nonchalant way that is a workplace gathering outside of a workplace. So it feels a little more familial than maybe something around some cubicle. So I will miss that aspect of it.
I mean, I think I missed I think there's always like, it seems like at every JPM, there's like a serendipitous moment where you run into somebody, whether it's in the street or a party or something, and they tell you something that's like becomes a great story or something that's like really thought provoking. And you can't do that over Zoom, right? That's the kind of thing that I think, just can't you have to be in the physical space with somebody to have that happen. And we're not going to have
Nobody
that.
ever lets their guard down on Zoom.
Right.
Really.
You mean you're not with people who are so drunk that they tell you things that they shouldn't tell you? That's
Exactly.
kind of what
Yeah,
happens. Okay.
That is, but even in meetings, sitting on the sidelines where people, you feel very much, we're on a screen right now, right? You feel like you're on TV. You can't feel more on the record than I think we feel right now. And that's what I miss about the in-person meetings, that there's kind of a lightness to talking to people that is just missing.
Yeah, I mean, Corey Kasimov won't be buying us drinks at the Four Seasons bar this year.
Precisely.
I mean, what am I going to do without that?
I won't have the nice long tiki bar conversation with a biotech executive who will remain nameless that shaped a lot of my coverage until we hit until the pandemic happened. I won't run into Alexis Borisy on the street. I mean, there's a lot of that you miss.
Corey, if you're watching, we'll have drinks in 2022, hopefully.
So Damien, we have a great question for you here. Will we finally move on from the amyloid hypothesis? Or did the FDA merely accepting aducanumab's application do enough to ensure that we'll continue to see companies addressing this strategy when trying to treat Alzheimer's? This is from Mike Maloney. And I just knew that everyone would enjoy this one. So amyloid, dead or not? Is this a dead horse we're beating or a zombie horse?
So obviously, if aducanumab were approved, then the horse is reincarnated enough to the races with respect to amyloid. But I think maybe the question presupposes that it would be rejected, because that would be the only chance that it gets rejected, or that the hypothesis is finally put to rest. I think it's really unlikely. I think the FDA signaling that, to get into the weeds of the aducanumab meeting, that they accepted its biological effect on amyloid in the brain as a sign as good as being something that is desirable for patients with Alzheimer's. That leaves the door open, even if the agency eventually rejects aducanumab, because they can point to, well, the data set were messy and all the things that we don't really need to relitigate here. So if I'm an amyloid adjacent or amyloid pursuing biotech company, it's hard not to see the silver lining there. That hey, the FDA was 80% there, and then they got beaten back by these nasty experts and the cruel press that dragged it through the mud. But there's clearly some wiggle room where if you could just get a cleaner data set that was similar to the aducanumab data, there is a constituency at FDA, we don't know how large, but definitely in the neuroscience department, that wants to approve your drug. So no, I feel that amyloid will outlive us all.
I think it's more than that, Damien, because I think there are a lot of people in the pro-amyloid space who think that if Biogen had not halted that trial, that if they had not, we talked a lot about data monitoring committees with vaccine trials, but this was another DMC story, and that if Biogen had handled their interim analysis better and had not stopped, had different stopping rules, that they'd be getting approved. You can't run the counterfactual, and just as you can't interpret a trial with a messed up analysis. But I think that for a lot of the pro amyloid people, they do see it as, well, we're really almost there this time. It is kind of the Zeno's paradox of biotech, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, these questions can be
But getting back to that second, just, I mean,
yeah.
we talked about the four horsemen thing, and obviously aducanumab is a very big event for early 2021. I guess the PDUFA date's March, right?
March 7th, I think. Yeah.
I mean, that's a big deal. That's going to be a big decision. And, obviously it has a huge impact on Alzheimer's and people with Alzheimer's and their families and their caregivers. It has a huge impact on Biogen. What will Biogen do we know what Biogen will do if it's approved. Although there will be questions about access and stuff like that. But if it's not, if it's rejected, what does Biogen look like in a post aducanumab world?
It's going to be, if it is approved after that panel, it's going to be quite a decision for the FDA, and I'd expect a lot of blowback from the other side of given that panel was so negative on those data. Was that panel was basically the panel lecturing the FDA on why they shouldn't even be considering this. So I was going to say, we again, the audience, we have two upvoted questions that are exactly the same question. How are the valuations of gene editing companies sustainable? And is there a valuation bubble in the cell therapy, gene therapy space? It's obviously a really hot space. We also have seen, the BioMarin delay, that it's actually proving, and Adam's, which we should talk about a little bit, Adam's best worst CEO list. With the Bluebird, with Bluebird being on the potential worst list. We're seeing a lot of gene therapy is not easy. We're seeing a lot of hiccups here.
I think to answer, there's quite the two questions, Stanley Frankel and Mark Hong. I'm seeing them here, kind of similar questions. I think the bubble, the valuations get ahead of the companies when all they have to do is show data, right? And you can show relatively small amounts of data, a couple of patients here and there. And if you show an effect, your stock goes up and your valuation increases. We're seeing that. I think we've seen that time and time again in a variety of gene therapy companies, cell therapy companies, CRISPR-based companies. We just wrote about one, CRISPR Therapeutics and the Vertex deal. The difficulties and where that sort of crashes is when the companies have to manufacture and these gene therapies and show, particularly when they have to prove to the FDA, apparently, that they can make these things in quality control and all those sorts of, I'm learning all about assays in gene therapy now. It seems to be like the thing that is tripping everybody up. And that's where the difficulties have certainly this year have come up, and companies who have stumbled and where valuations start to retract is when, we've seen delays like in Bluebird and other companies who've had these problems. So that's, there's two sides to that story.
Yeah, I was going to say, with respect to gene therapy valuations, I wonder if gene therapy is maybe reaching the point where it becomes too quaint to say gene therapy. Like, we wouldn't say like, oh, are monoclonal antibody companies too overvalued, or can they sustain their valuations? Because that's just like a technology you can do whatever you want with. And I was thinking that, Adam, as you said that, because BioMarin's regulatory issue with hemophilia A is not necessarily entirely applicable to gene therapy as a whole, because in hemophilia A, there are fantastic medicines. If you contrast that to the Zolgensma story, where we know the FDA situation was interesting, maybe that's a bad example as a result, but that was a lot more frictionless with respect to getting that product approved. And I think that says more about spinal muscular atrophy, which does have approved therapies, but still, than it does about like gene therapy as a whole. So we might be reaching the point where these valuations should be considered apart from one another. But then, Adam, your other point, they are united by the fact that proving to the FDA that what you studied in clinical trials is the same as what you're going to sell to people is apparently still really difficult for a lot of these companies. So I guess until they reach like escape velocity in that sense, which I guess is Bob Nelson's dream, they will still be kind of united by one another.
And maybe
Kate,
that's
let me
not
ask.
necessarily
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
inappropriate
Sorry,
either.
Kate.
I was going to say, like, the notion of gene therapy as this thing that if you get it right and if you can do it well, if you can create it, if you can show an effect, that you can just like stick in different genetic material and you're done. Like there goes all eye diseases. That's obviously a little too rosy, but I wonder, I suppose, if maybe some of these valuations being as high as they are is because people are kind of still thinking of them like that, are kind of still like grouping them together as this has a lot of potential if they can just get one thing right, and then we're done. Like, so in that respect, I don't necessarily know if I would say, oh yeah, that's definitely too high, or oh yeah, there's definitely a bubble, because I think some of that optimism is probably a little grounded just by like the principles of the thing. But as Adam said, it is not a simple thing to just stick in new genetic material into an AAV vector, or an AAV rather, and just call it a day. So, that's not a good answer, but that's kind of like how I'm thinking about that question, I suppose, is I can see why there would be high valuations, but also I can, Adam's point about manufacturing and Adam's point about there being more difficulties perhaps than at first appreciated is
This could become oddly like the targeted cancer therapy market, where a lot of companies end up not taking things all the way, even though those are very easy to make. But it may be that there's a reason to have a high valuation for young gene therapy companies, because if you have that good data, maybe the play is not to become standalone, but to get bought by some of these other gene therapy companies, or by companies like Pfizer and Bayer, who are suddenly very interested in the space. So they may get high valuations because you can kind of flip them.
Well, and I also kind of like, just to bring things back to what I was saying, and also bring things back a little bit to COVID, I was going to compare it to Moderna, right? Where if it's like, if you can get the idea of doing these vaccines or using mRNA in this way, you validated the platform. Hooray. Now it should be relatively easy, again, like massive air quotes there, to explore the rest of the indications that they had hoped to. Now, whether or not that's actually, what happened is, I think, something that we can certainly talk about. But I think it's been really interesting to like watch this very, platformy company go through this very unusual time and get some potentially really validating information out of it in a way that I don't even know that they had expected to. I know they would probably say that this is exactly what they were made for. But as much as we all could have, I suppose, predicted that a pandemic would happen, this exact one happening in this exact way is rare, I suppose. So
maybe we need to see like a gene therapy roll-up company, like
Mm.
the Valiant of gene therapy.
I mean, it makes more sense than Valiant did.
Without the scandal and all the other stuff.
Well, wasn't Valiant without the scandal Allergan. So another question I want to get to, we're coming close to wrap up time, but in January 2020, we apparently pegged, according to Christina Campbell, neuroscience is the big area for development in the year ahead, and obviously, and moving away from immuno-oncology, which hasn't happened. And given the dark horse of vaccines actually being the big deal, what do we think we'll see in 2021? Before answering this question, I just want to note that I think if you'd come to any of us and told us in December 2019 that the big biotechnology for 2020 was going to be mRNA, I don't think I would have believed that, Damien. I mean, you've done a lot of mRNA writing over the years. Would you have seen it as overtaking everything else?
No, I mean, and the only way I wouldn't have even thought of vaccines, I would have assumed that must mean that Moderna, presumably, or even BioNTech or CureVac had shown just incredible results in a chronic disease where the mRNA therapy was safe and efficacious, which I don't think anybody necessarily had in the cards, especially in terms of how early stage those programs are.
Well,
so,
or cancer.
No, I never could have imagined.
Is big for the companies,
yeah.
right? So it could have been cancer immunotherapy, but so before we make any predictions, nobody would have predicted this. Does anybody have any? I know you.
But it was a big year for CNS, though. I mean, I think we were right about that.
I still want to say neuroscience for next year as well, to be honest. Like, I think there's still a lot of room to explore there, and I think there's still a lot of interest to explore there.
Well, one surprise was it turned out to be a reasonably big year for cardiology, which is one of my favorite topics and has also been kind of dead water since the PCSK9s failed, particularly with myocardia being a standout there, but still kind of a rare disease approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the inclisiran, the every 6 month PCSK9, which maybe people aren't it's not maybe scientifically the most fascinating thing because that target is so well understood, but its actual commercial performance, I think, will be interesting as you look kind of downstream as cardiology gets more rare disease-esque and companies like Verve Therapeutics or different technologies come into play in the heart. The viability of that commercially, I think we'll come to understand a lot better this year.
Well, with that, I think we're at about time, and it's time to wrap things up. It's always fun chatting with all of you, and we do this all the time, but it's somehow even more fun with an audience.
Will we be doing this in live next year? We do this every December, so maybe that's the way to maybe that's the way to end it. Like, do you think that we'll be in New York doing this live in December of next year?
I think there's a good chance. That's pretty long after the vaccines are supposed to have rolled out. I do wonder how people's attitudes toward in-person gatherings will have changed from a year of not gathering. And I obviously, since I do events here, I'm thinking about this a lot. But I'm hoping we'll do something in person in New York next year.
I'd like that.
Yeah, it'd be good to actually see you again. So thanks to Adam, Damien, and Kate, and thanks to all of you out there for attending, and thanks to our sponsor, Brunswick. Keep an eye out for more Stat Virtual events. Subscribers can attend Stat Plus conversations every week, and we will be having several summits next year. Until then, everyone stay safe and be well.
Bye. Listen to our podcast.
Stay on Stat all the time. It's awesome. It really is.